soon-to-be Prime Minister. What sort of a Prime Minister do you think he's going to be? Oh, for sake. Hello and welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. I'm Jo Moyer and I'm back in Wellington with Mark Dalder. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Jo.
And in Auckland we have Tim Murphy. Hello, Tim.
Hello, guys.
Well, this is it from Raw Politics, the final show, for now. So settle in while we dissect the first week post-election, what it all means, and then we'll offer some bouquets to the losers, who are actually maybe kind of winners. And to wrap up, of course, we'll offer you some recommendations. First up, the week that was, or in this case, wasn't. No government yet, no clear indication of whether Chris Hipkins will remain as Labour leader for all of this term, and not a single word from Winston Peters. Tim, let's start with National's win at the weekend. Christopher Luxon, soon to be Prime Minister. How do you think he's going to go?
Oh, well, as I've said throughout this podcast series, anyone can be Prime Minister. I think basically you get in, you get this vast turbocharge of support of all kinds of people with all kinds of expertise, political, governmental, foreign affairs, financial. And so you have every element of power at your discretion. So I think he'll be fine. He got a lot better, didn't he, during the campaign? He actually became much more proficient as a politician. I think he won't go as fast as he hopes to because Peters isn't a handbrake. New Zealand First is more of sort of road spikes thrown in front of your car. And so National and ACT will sort of grind to this sort of wheels on the rims on the roadway soon, if that's what happens, and it looks like it will. So I think it'll be a slower, possibly more frustrating time for Luxon than, on the night, Jo, at the start of the night at the National headquarters, it all seemed very positive. They were ebullient. It was as if they'd, got a Jacinda-style 50% when they hit 42 or something. And then, of course, it was always going to come back and it has now to 38.9 or whatever it is. So, it actually isn't that big a victory for National other than achieving the very big goal of getting Labour out of government and putting them in place in government.
Yeah, I think it's become increasingly clear that they will do a deal with New Zealand First no matter what. And there's a couple of reasons for that, right? I mean, there is that sort of protection that you need if you've only got a slim majority and obviously a lot of inexperienced, untested new MPs coming into that National Party caucus. So you don't want to run the risk that, you might lose one perhaps. And the other factor, of course, in all of that is if you're Christopher Luxon, would see having ACT and New Zealand First both in play as an opportunity to sort of leverage them off against each other. ACT has got some kind of, some National MPs would think wild ideas that it would like to push through with. New Zealand First might be able to be used to kind of pull some of that back. And of course, with ACT in play, New Zealand First, given they're not going to go with Labour, there's no opportunity on that side, of course, doesn't have the same amount of leverage either. So it does change things up a bit. Mark, what's your thoughts, I guess, on how things have gone this week? There hasn't been anything much. We saw Christopher Luxon on Caucus Run on Tuesday morning saying absolutely nothing. He's running this line about wanting to do negotiations differently. Do you buy into that anything will be different about them?
Well, we had this discussion a little bit, and I think he has a bit of an advantage here over, say, Bill English in that yes, he's trying to negotiate between Winston Peters and David Seymour and maybe play them off against each other a little bit, but he's not trying to convince Winston Peters to pick him over Labour, right? So the sort of leaks and strategic leaks that you might have seen in past coalition negotiations, there's a lot more motivation for that when there's a risk that you might not be able to form a government, and so you need to be doing that sort of thing and be showing each of these minor party supporters, what's actually on the table here. In this case, it is easier to get by, to argue actually, if we all agree no leaks, that will help all of us. It will make us look like a stable government, and that's perhaps the biggest criticism or sort of perception that we have to overcome in our initial stages of negotiation and forming a government is that stability, that ability to work together. That said, it's never 100% perfect. We've already had some bits and pieces of leaks and understandings, and some that have been flat out denied, some of them that have been not commented on. I think Christopher Luxon's in for a bit of a frustrating couple of weeks of being asked these questions and refusing to answer them or talk about them at all. He decided on Wednesday just not to make himself available for media after being asked on Tuesday, why are you calling us here and asking us to ask you questions and then not answering any of the questions. So he clearly took that feedback on board. But, a few weeks to go till the specials come out. I think it'll be a bit more of that still to see.
I mean, Winston's arrival in Wellington was kind of everything you expected it to be and more. I did note that when he arrived at the airport on Wednesday, the group of journalists who were a mixture of kind of Wellington-based journalists and a couple of press gallery journalists are all new journalists in the sense that this was their first election campaign. So they haven't been in Parliament when Winston Peters has been here before. So, of course, Winston would have arrived and taken one look at the pack and thought, I don't know who any of you are, been completely infuriated by the fact that none of the journalists he does know actually bothered to turn up to meet him at the airport. So that would have set a tone initially, I think. And then, of course, you saw the 27 questions, I think it was, with absolutely no answers. But, I mean, there's no suggestion that just because Winston's not talking, that doesn't mean we're not going to have any clue of sort of what's going on. The back-channeling stuff is happening from both ACT and New Zealand First, and you would expect that because ACT and New Zealand First need to get a good deal, and the media for them will actually play a role in that. As much as Christopher Luxon doesn't want it to, it actually will. Tim, just on ACT and David Seymour, what have you made of him over, I mean, we've talked about this on the podcast before about his kind of energy levels and being a bit more mellow as Winston Peters has kind of picked up in the polls. He will be pretty frustrated at the moment that New Zealand First will be getting more of the oxygen, right?
Yeah, but he also knows that he knows what he wants and what he's aiming for. So he'll be able to be quite narrow now in his targets, I think, for some of those things like some of the education associate, possibly some of that policy area there, but also, public service and what they can drive there in terms of cuts and transformation and reform. I think that he is probably playing a good game now, keeping it reasonably close to his chest, bringing it back, focusing on what he can influence and what he thinks he can get out of national, and perhaps what Peters and that New Zealand First won't be interested in, or less interested in, and less sort of willing to try to barge in on, if you like. So I think it's no bad thing that Peters says nothing. I think I probably don't agree so much with your position, Joe, that stuff will necessarily come out in these weeks to come if they're all tight. I think, the public probably welcome respite from the whole bloody thing, and if they all stay stung for a little bit, it might give everybody a chance to catch their breath while some real progress can be sort of put together.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I'm pro nobody talking at all because then we can all just go and have a holiday for a week. Sure you'd be signing off on that, Tim?
I would.
Does gallery just disappear?
Yeah, probably a good time to clarify that I made a joke about being on holiday for about 6 months last episode. I am not going on holiday for 6 months. I won't abandon Jo to whatever comes next to fend it off on her lonesome.
I've put a GPS on him. I can track his every movement. Let's have a chat about Labour. Of course, not the winners on the night. Very much the losers. Obviously, they had talked about the surge they thought that they were experiencing that did not come to play. What did you make of? You were there, Mark. Obviously, in the hut at Labour headquarters. Sounds like the mood was pretty horrendous.
Yeah, I mean, I think the results came in, and I went to go grab a glass of water, and the line for the bar was 40 people long, just sort of like that. So that sort of set the mood. To be fair, it wasn't like a surprise for people, so it wasn't maybe quite the level of dismay as I got the sense National had in 2020. It was just like people coming to a party which they expect to be sad about and being rewarded with, yes, that sad time that they were expecting. Maybe more of a wake than an election night party. It definitely cleared out after Chris Hipkins gave his speech. And to be fair, Chris Hipkins still managed to really rev the room up when he was there. It shows that for the Labour faithful, he's still a very popular leader. Which maybe contributes to some of those reasons for him deciding, at least initially, not to step down right after the election and to say that he's got a bit more fight in him. He definitely sounded like he had more fight in him at that party on the Saturday night.
Tim, when it comes to these losses after an election night, there's often sort of this narrative that runs about, well, the losing leader should go and give an opportunity to reset and all the rest of it. Is that in play here, do you think, with Chris Hipkins, or are the circumstances a little bit outside of the usual, I guess?
It shouldn't be in play if it is, because he had 9 months. It was a hospital pass. If you look at the deeper analysis for Labour, they were gone off from about May last year. It was deep. The visceral reaction around the country, and we all saw it, was so strong that, he came in January. Yes, there was a little bit of a sort of a uptick for a short time. Then his colleagues did him in, then the economy kept going poorly and all these reasons. There are things that weren't his fault. I don't think he campaigned well, that. We've talked about that for much of the campaign. But people who have campaigned poorly or averagely have come back from that to another campaign following and done better. Helen Clark was one. And others who, you learn a bit from it. I think that Hipkins is their best bet because I don't see anyone, especially with those who are going, and we know those who have sort of had their fill and moving out. I don't see anyone who could do it better for them in the next year, 2, 3, even through a campaign next time. So he shouldn't be thinking of going, in my view. And I think, he may well really prove himself in a year or two's time, once a government starts to get that government sort of stagger, if you like, when things aren't all just in the honeymoon or going as they'd hoped. So I think he should stick it in.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly has that opposition experience, and we know he's a performer in the House, and we know that he can sort of get under people's skin. So that will work to his advantage, I think, in this newfound opposition leader role. I guess, it is an opportunity for clear-outs, though. And one thing you've had with this election result, of course, is with Labour losing so many of its electorate seats. You've had basically you have had all but Nanaia Mahu to come back in terms of the cabinet. So you have actually still got quite a bit of experience there in that caucus. We've only had this week Andrew Little announce that he's not going to take that list spot. That's not surprising at all. I mean, Andrew Little was always going to call time in opposition. He, has had 12 portfolios in 6 years, had that Labour leadership run, which of course was where he reunited after some pretty terrible years in the Labour Party, that caucus, and set it up for Jacinda Ardern to take over. What comes next, I guess, is the likes of Willie Jackson and Grant Robertson. Willie Jackson, of course, on the list. Grant Robertson putting himself on the list and not running in Wellington Central to give him the opportunity, if he chose to, in opposition, to go and not cause a by-election. Grant has been pretty clear this week that he wants to help transition into opposition. Him and Chris Hipkins are probably the two best people they've got, plus Willie Jackson actually having that sort of fire in the belly to teach those other sort of not experienced opposition MPs how to do it, how to rough and tumble in the House, etc. So I think you'll see Grant stick around for sort of a few months or so, and Willie Jackson certainly hasn't committed to staying for the full term either. So it could be a few more to go, but for the most part, what has been interesting is that Labour caucus is not really got anyone new in it, which is in very stark contrast, of course, to the National Party, which is full of a lot of new faces and a lot of blue suits.
When National won big in 1990, they brought so many people in, a bit like Labour last time, but even worse, I think. People who were, they hardly knew, the leader and others hardly knew them. And that led in part to that big downturn the term after in 93, but also it led to lots of people peeling away to MMP parties once they started forming. So it was just such a broad church for National then, and it may well be now too, that it can lead to quite quickly to some sort of issues of fraying and almost dissolving of the sort of the whole wider caucus. So it's going to be very interesting.
And I guess maybe that a little bit accentuated by the seats that those people have won. You've got all those rural seats back, but you also have a handful of candidates coming in from these Auckland seats that have been these safe red seats. Doesn't mean that they're Labour MPs, but it's that broad church thing of having a range of views that you now have sitting around in your caucus room, and you need to make sure that everyone's happy. And then outside of the caucus room, you've got David Seymour and Winston Peters, who also need to be kept happy.
Who's going to be Nationals' Gaurav Sharma? Who do you nominate?
I don't know that we should be specifically picking out people.
Who's yours, Tim?
Well, look, I think silence is the best option to that question. Sorry.
Good. Let's finish that segment with a question nobody wants to answer. Excellent. Now let's have a chat about the other winners, the MPs in opposition, who actually smashed it out of the park, really. Mark, let's start with the Greens. They now have 3 electorates. I'm not sure if anyone successfully picked that would be the case.
Yeah, I mean, the Greens would say they did. James Shaw said he was speaking to me on sometime the final week of the election. It all blends together a little bit. Said, that they're on track to get 3 or 4 electorates. And so he felt quite confident about that, clearly. Wellington Central seemed like a bit of a shoe-in. It was that 3-way race, very similar to Auckland Central in that way, and it seemed pretty obvious that Tamitha, had that opportunity to slip through the middle. I think Rongotai is the one that people were surprised by, and certainly were doubtful at the start of the year that Julianne would be able to flip what's a really, really safe red seat in a head-to-head race, and, no real national candidate to be distracting them. The other thing, of course, is just the Greens party vote, right? They're at 14 MPs. That's tied for best ever. On the specials, maybe they go up one. Even if not, to be in government for 6 years, to do a bunch of stuff on climate change, but be dealing with a membership that just last year turfed one of your leaders out of office for a few months, and actually come back from that and grow the caucus to tie your record best after those 6 years in government. I think there's not much to be unhappy about other than the fact that you're not in government anymore.
I mean, having talked to some Labour peeps kind of in the last couple of days ahead of the election, I think they had pretty much resigned themselves that they'd probably lose Wellington Central and that it was going to be difficult. But they certainly were not thinking that Rongotai was going to go. In fact, they were sort of quite, Julianne Genter probably thinks she'll win that, but she certainly won't. So that was definitely the real surprise one there. In terms of the style that they're going to have, so opposition, they've been there before, but it is quite a different party this time around and a different leadership too. How do you think that's going to go?
I think having been in government and having had that experience of developing policy, both as a minister, but also, the quality of the policy that they took to this election in terms of the costings, in terms of how robustly they'd thought through it, much higher than maybe the Green Party might have done in the past. So in this opposition, it's not quite the same as maybe last term, where there were periods where you'd say, is David Seymour the real leader of the opposition, or is it Judith Collins? I don't think it's quite that sort of dynamic. As well, the Greens are more friendly with Labour than ACT was with National. But they're not second fiddle here either. They are a force unto themselves, and will be sort of a big part of whatever that opposition ends up looking like.
Yeah, I mean, Te Pāti Māori too obviously had an amazing night, collecting 4 seats, and on special votes, there's still 1 or 2 that are looking pretty close at the moment. What struck me, Tim, is having had an interview with co-leader Debbie Ngāti-Wapaka only a few days out from the election, and her being quite clear that they knew that they would not win Hauraki Waikato or Te Tai Tonga, and they had put their candidates in those seats in 4th and 5th on the list in the hope that they might get enough of a party vote in order to bring them in, because they thought, well, if they're going to win any electorates, it won't be those. And to have them come through was incredible. I mean, Te Tai Tonga is completely out the gate for them to have won there, and Hauraki Waikato for Nanaia Mahuta after 27 years, considering she's been up against it in previous elections with, the Kingitanga backing the Māori Party previously, and her having to not only win against the party, but to win against Kingitanga as well. She will be wondering, I guess, what went wrong. How do you think that Te Pāti Māori is going to go, Tim, with, that sort of beefed up caucus, obviously 2 younger members in there, but what should we expect from them this term?
Well, this results is a generational change, isn't it, for them, reinforcing a whole shift away from what the Māori Party used to be. And they say that, young people, that they motivated and got younger voters out who delivered them some of these results. It's also clear now that the historical Labour lock on the Māori seats, it's been taken away from them by New Zealand First in the 90s, by the earlier version of the Māori Party took a few, and now this, it's just not probably ever going to return to a long period of all Labour or dominated Labour as it was. And so every sort of, the perceived wisdom always is that Māori are locked onto Labour, Ratana Church is locked onto Labour, that kind of stuff, but it isn't really the case anymore. This is a really big result for the Māori Party, as it is for the Greens in this respect. The more seats you have, and if your party vote tends to dip or does dip for some reason in the next 3 years or the 3 years after that, the more options you have to keep that wild card or that super card, if you like, to get back into Parliament. So the Greens will have that now by 3. You'd presume that not all 3 of them could get wildly unpopular at once to lose their seat. With the Māori Party, they had Rawiri's seat before, and that was their guarantee. Now they've got 3 more, maybe more, as you say, Joe. So that longer-term guarantee, you can almost rely on seeing those 2 parties for a couple of elections from now at least represented, and probably well. So yes, it brings in talent, but it also brings in reassurance for them going forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's just come a really long way. You look at that shock 2017 result when Te Orara Flavel lost Wairiki and the party was out. And I'm sure that commentators, probably including myself, said at the time that it will be really, really hard for the Māori Party to come back from that. But, kudos to Debbie and Rawiri. They have really kind of, changed things up. They've reshaped and refocused, I guess, what that party's doing. And like you say, Tim, that generational shift is really starting to come through now. I think Tohenare or someone had said, this is the kohanga reo sort of generation coming through, and I think that's 100% true. One other thing we've talked about, Mark, is Mika Whaitere. Of course, she was 3rd on the party list, but was running for Te Pāti Māori in Ikaroa Rāwhiti. There was a bit of assumption that she could probably win that seat just because she had such a big majority under Labour, and there was a question mark as to whether that would follow her or not. Willie Jackson had been pretty vocal about the fact that he thought that the vote would stay with Labour. He has proven to be correct, of course. That seat has stayed with Labour. But do you think in some ways that you could almost argue that it is an anti-Labour vote with Mika Whaitere? Because, of course, it's not that long ago that she was a Labour minister. She left the electorate in a brutal time for the East Coast, off the back of Cyclone Gabrielle, where she'd been doing a lot of work to look after that community and advocate for them. Do you think that there is sort of an argument to be made that while she was running for a different party, perhaps this was actually a strike against Labour too?
Yeah, possibly. I think in the Māori seats, the dynamic that we saw was a bit different from in the general electorates and in the party vote nationwide, in that Labour still won a plurality of the party vote in every single one of those 7 seats. In many cases, or in some cases at least, it outperformed in the party vote how its candidates performed. And so it's not that the voters there were leaving Labour in droves. I mean, sure, they came down from 2020, but I think that people have quite effectively in those seats distinguished between your party vote as your tool for creating a government and your electorate vote as your tool for picking a person, and seeing Mecca tied to maybe the incumbents, the government, the failure of the government to help out the East Coast, as well as just seeing her switch parties and maybe going, is that sort of disloyalty something that we want to reward? Or do we just prefer to respect someone who, when their time is up, they step down rather than trying to, flip it and get an extra lifeline out of that,
Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you've watched, read or listened to this week that you've enjoyed. Tim, let's start with you.
I provoked a little bit of debate and back chat in the final week of the campaign by saying that I thought the New Zealand media had served the public well overall, not every bit of everything, but overall in this campaign, and I hold to that. And one of those who was doing really very good work throughout was Derek Chang of the Herald, who after the election has written a very fine piece on how Labour's big lead from 2020 fell apart, when, how, and what sort of drove it. And it's well worth a read.
What about you, Mark?
I'm doing something non-election related, but a piece in the New York Times by a member of the Israeli parliament, an Arab member of the Israeli parliament, about what it takes to prioritize peace over revenge. It's a really thoughtful read for people who are sort of maybe grappling with different feelings and thoughts at this time around this issue. It's worth centering some of that stuff.
And my recommendation is you, Mark. It's our newsroom rec for the week. Mark's piece titled Ghosts of Long Lockdown Haunt Labour. This is from the Labour headquarters on election night. Very good, succinct summary of what had led to the Labour loss. So go check that one out. That's it from Raw Politics. Thank you to our producer, Hugo Stewart, and thank you so much to our readers, listeners, and viewers. Raw Politics has been enjoyed by more people than we ever imagined would care what the three of us have to say on absolutely anything, and for that, we are very, very grateful. Tim, just throwing to you here, any clarifications, regrets, apologies you'd like to share before we go?
None of the above. Look, it's been fun, and I think it helped sort of bring our own thinking together at critical times in this campaign. And I really will miss doing it, but we'll be back when the moment arises.
Mark, any jokes you've had stored up for months and months and months that you really need to get out of your system?
I've got a long, laundry list of complaints, personal complaints and grievances about various members of the staff and crew. Tim, you owe me, I think, $20 for those fringe parties not endorsing New Zealand First. Also, while Raw Politics is ending, maybe for now, I'm pitching right now a new podcast, Raw Emissions Trading Scheme. If you want to see that, please email tim.murphy@newsroom.co.nz and encourage him to support my new effort.
I knew I made a mistake when I offered you an opportunity to speak one last time. I don't have anything to say other than I did not think that this would last more than a few weeks. I definitely didn't think anyone would listen, and I have been surprised, and my heart has been warmed by how many people have actually commented on how much they've enjoyed it and how regularly they listen. So that has been a pretty great thing, and what has been at times been a bit of a bleak year. So appreciate that one. Wow, that's it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye and go well. Raw Politics, over and out.